The ballroom of Evermont Manor shimmered beneath cascading chandeliers, each crystal catching the light like a carefully curated illusion. Music drifted softly through the air, a string quartet playing something delicate and expensive, the kind of melody meant to impress rather than move. Nobles, investors, and social elites filled the room in clusters of quiet conversation, their laughter measured, their glances calculating. Every presence here had purpose. At the center of it all stood Duke Alistair Evermont. Tall, composed, and unreadable as ever, he held a glass of champagne in one hand, while the other rested lightly over that of his fiancée, Lillian Voss. She leaned into him just enough to appear devoted, her fingers curled possessively around his arm. Her gown shimmered in pale gold silk, tailored to perfection, her smile just as polished. To anyone watching, and everyone was, they were the image of aristocratic unity. "Shall we?" Alistair murmured. Lillian nodded, her expression softening instantly as if on cue. The Duke stepped forward, raising his glass. The room gradually quieted, conversations dissolving into attentive silence, dozens of eyes fixed on him. "My friends," he began, his voice smooth and controlled, carrying easily across the hall. "Tonight is not simply a celebration of legacy, but of future." A few approving nods followed. Lillian's grip on his arm tightened ever so slightly. "I stand here," he continued, "not only as the heir to Evermont, but as a man fortunate enough to have found—" His voice faltered. For a brief second, it was subtle, almost unnoticeable. But then his hand trembled. The champagne glass slipped from his fingers. It shattered against the marble floor, the sharp crack slicing through the room like a gunshot. Gasps erupted. Alistair's expression twisted, not dramatically, but just enough to signal something deeply wrong. His other hand moved to his chest, gripping tightly as if trying to hold something in place. "Alistair!" Lillian's voice broke, though her eyes flashed with something quicker than concern, something sharper. The Duke staggered, then collapsed. The room descended into chaos. Guests rushed forward, some calling for help, others simply staring, stunned into stillness. A few instinctively stepped back, unwilling to be too close to a disaster. "Someone call a doctor," a voice shouted. "I am a doctor," another responded, pushing through the crowd. Lillian dropped to her knees beside him, her hands hovering over his body before finally settling on his shoulders. "Alistair, can you hear me?" she cried, her voice trembling just enough to sound convincing. Tears welled in her eyes, though none fell yet. She glanced around quickly, too quickly, taking stock of who was watching. Then she leaned closer, her voice dropping into a whisper only he should have heard. "This isn't funny." But Alistair did not respond. Within minutes, the ballroom transformed from a place of elegance into a scene of urgency. Medical staff, summoned in haste, arrived with equipment, their calm efficiency cutting through the panic. Guests were ushered back. The music had long since stopped. "Pulse is weak," one medic muttered. "Prepare transport, now." Lillian clutched his hand as they worked, her expression now fully collapsed into grief. A tear finally slipped down her cheek. "Stay with me," she whispered, louder this time. "Please, stay with me." Yet, as the stretcher was lifted, and the Duke's unmoving body carried away, her gaze shifted, just briefly, toward the far end of the room, toward the grand staircase, toward the corridors that led deeper into the manor. Something flickered behind her sorrow. Not fear, not loss. Calculation. Hours later, Evermont Manor stood eerily quiet. The guests were gone, their whispers already spreading beyond its walls. Servants moved in hushed tones, clearing the remnants of a shattered evening. By midnight, the verdict had settled like a shadow over the estate. The Duke was alive, but unresponsive. A coma. In her private chamber, Lillian stood by the window, her reflection faint against the dark glass. The softness had vanished from her face. She exhaled slowly, then reached for her phone. "He's unconscious," she said quietly when the line connected. No timeline yet." A pause. "Yes," she added, her tone sharpening. "We need to move quickly." Down in the servants' corridor, far from chandeliers and silk, a young woman stood half hidden in the dim light. Clara. Her uniform had been stripped from her hours earlier. In its place, a plain dress. In her hand, a single folded paper, creased, clenched, and nearly torn apart from how tightly she held it. Termination notice. Her eyes lifted toward the ceiling, toward the world above her, toward Lillian, toward the Duke. She had seen everything, and she said nothing. Not yet. Morning light filtered through the tall windows of Evermont Manor, pale and indifferent, as if unaware that something fundamental had shifted within its walls. The grand estate, once animated by quiet luxury, now carried a strained stillness. Servants moved softly, their footsteps cautious, their voices lowered to whispers that dissolved before reaching the high ceilings. At the heart of it all, behind carved oak doors, the Duke lay unmoving. Alistair Evermont rested against pristine white sheets, his face unnaturally calm, as though sleep had claimed him too deeply to return. Medical equipment surrounded the bed, monitors humming faintly, a steady rhythm marking the passage of time he appeared unable to feel. Tubes traced along his arms, oxygen resting near his lips, completing the illusion of fragility. Visitors came. They always did. Some arrived out of genuine concern, their expressions heavy with sympathy. Others came with curiosity carefully disguised as loyalty. They stood at a respectful distance, murmuring soft prayers and polite reassurances, glancing occasionally at Lillian as though measuring her grief. She never faltered. Seated at his bedside, she played her part with unsettling precision. Her posture was perfect, her movements slow and deliberate, as if every gesture carried emotional weight. When someone spoke to her, she answered in a fragile voice, barely above a whisper. "He was fine," she would say, eyes shimmering. "Just moments before—" Sometimes she reached for his hand, holding it as though anchoring herself to him. Other times she simply stared, her gaze fixed, distant, as if lost in memories only she could see. "I won't leave him," she told one guest firmly, "not for a moment." And for those watching, it was enough. More than enough. The image of devotion settled easily into their minds. But devotion, like everything else in Evermont Manor, depended on who was watching. When the last visitor left and the door clicked softly shut, the room changed. The softness drained from her expression, as though it had never existed. Her shoulders straightened, her breathing steadied, and the faint tremble in her hands disappeared completely. She released the Duke's hand without hesitation, letting it fall limply back against the sheets. Silence lingered for a moment. Then she stood. "I can't wait forever," she muttered under her breath, pacing slowly across the room. Her heels clicked softly against the polished floor, the only sound breaking the stillness. "This is taking too long." She stopped near the desk, her eyes scanning its surface before pulling open a drawer. Papers shifted under her fingers. Documents, letters, sealed envelopes. She flipped through them quickly, her patience thinning with each second. "Where would you keep it?" she murmured. Her gaze flicked briefly toward the bed. Alistair did not move, but beneath closed eyelids, behind the stillness of his body, awareness remained. He heard everything. Every word, every movement, every shift in tone, the faint rustle of paper, the sharp edge in her voice, the absence of grief when no one was there to witness it. His breathing stayed slow, controlled, measured to perfection. It had taken days to master the stillness, to train his body not to react. Even now, every instinct urged him to open his eyes, to confront her, to end the performance. But he remained motionless, because this was the truth he had been waiting for. Back at the desk, Lillian exhaled sharply, frustration creeping in. She closed the drawer harder than necessary and reached for her phone instead. "They're dragging this out," she said quietly once the call connected. Her tone had shifted again, colder now, stripped of any pretense. "No, he's still alive, but completely unresponsive." A pause, her lips pressed into a thin line. "I don't care about appearances," she continued. "If the will hasn't been finalized, we have a problem." Another pause, longer this time. "Yes," she said finally, her voice dropping. "Find out who has access. I want answers today." She ended the call and stood there for a moment, staring at nothing in particular. Then, slowly, her gaze returned to the Duke. For a brief second, something unreadable passed through her expression. Not guilt. Not quite, but something close to irritation. "You should have handled this already," she said quietly, almost conversationally. "It would have been easier." She stepped closer to the bed, leaning slightly over him, studying his face as though searching for any sign of awareness. There was none. Satisfied, she turned away. Unseen by her, a small camera embedded high in the corner of the room captured everything, every word, every shift, every truth she thought hidden. Elsewhere in the manor, in a dim servant's quarters no longer assigned to anyone, a screen flickered to life. Clara stood before it, her arms crossed tightly. She watched. Every moment, every lie. Her jaw tightened as Lillian's voice echoed faintly through the monitor. "They fired me for her," Clara whispered, her voice low and steady, though something darker simmered beneath it. "For this." The termination letter lay discarded beside her now, forgotten but not forgiven. Her eyes remained fixed on the screen, unblinking. "This house," she said softly, almost to herself, "doesn't belong to people like her." Silence followed. But it was not empty, it was waiting. By the time night settled over Evermont Manor, the air had turned heavy with the promise of rain. Low thunder rolled in the distance, slow and deliberate, as if the sky itself were watching. Inside, the estate stood unnaturally still, its grand corridors dimly lit, its silence deeper than usual, as though something unseen had already begun to move. It started with a flicker. The lights trembled once, briefly, before stabilizing. A servant glanced upward, uneasy, but said nothing. Moments later, it happened again. Longer this time. Shadows stretched and recoiled along the walls, distorting the familiar into something uncertain. Then the power dropped. Darkness swallowed the manor whole. A few distant voices called out in confusion, but the backup generators hesitated, failing to respond immediately. In that suspended moment, the estate felt abandoned, cut off from order, from control. And in that darkness, someone moved. Clara slipped through the servants' entrance like she had never left. The absence of light didn't slow her. If anything, it sharpened her. She knew these halls intimately. Every narrow passage, every concealed door, every blind corner that cameras couldn't reach. Her steps were quiet, deliberate, guided more by memory than sight. In her hand, she carried a small glass vial. Inside, a thick amber liquid shifted with each movement, catching faint glimmers of lightning through the windows. She held it carefully, almost reverently. Upstairs in the Duke's chamber, Lillian sat beside the bed, her posture rigid. "What now?" she muttered under her breath, glancing toward the door as the darkness settled in. Irritation edged her voice more than fear, though her fingers tapped restlessly against her arm. A distant door creaked. She froze. "Hello," she called out, her voice sharper now. "Is someone there?" No response, only the faint sound of thunder pressing closer. Then, a soft step, not from the hallway, from inside the room. Lillian's breath caught as a shape emerged from the shadows near the far wall. At first it was indistinct, little more than a darker presence within the dark. But as lightning flashed through the tall windows, the figure became clear. "Clara." "You shouldn't be here," Clara said calmly. The words landed without urgency, without emotion, but they carried something far heavier. Recognition hit instantly. "You—" Lillian stepped back, her voice tightening. "You were dismissed." "Yes," Clara replied, taking another slow step forward. "I remember." The distance between them shrank. Lillian's composure faltered, just slightly. "You need to leave, now. This is private property." Clara didn't stop. "This house was my life," she said quietly, "until you decided it wasn't worth anything." "That's not my concern," Lillian snapped, though her voice wavered. Her eyes darted toward the door, calculating distance, escape. "Guards will be here any second." "Maybe," Clara said. Another step. The vial caught a flash of lightning, glowing briefly in her hand. Lillian's gaze dropped to it. "What is that?" Clara didn't answer immediately. Instead, she closed the final gap between them in one swift motion, her hand shooting out to seize Lillian's wrist. The grip was firm, unyielding. "Drink," Clara said. Lillian gasped, instinctively pulling back, but Clara's hold tightened. "What are you doing?" Lillian struggled, panic rising now, no longer contained. "Let go of me!" "Justice doesn't wait," Clara replied, her voice steady, almost detached. She forced the vial toward Lillian's hand, pressing it into her palm. "Drink." "I'm not touching that!" Lillian cried, her control breaking. "You're insane!" "For believing in consequences?" Clara tilted her head slightly. "Maybe." Footsteps echoed suddenly from the corridor, fast, urgent. The backup power surged faintly, lights flickering back to life in uneven bursts. The door rattled as voices called from outside. "Lady Voss." Clara didn't turn. Her focus never left Lillian. "Too late," she whispered. Lillian's grip faltered under the pressure, and the vial slipped from her hand, falling to the floor with a sharp crack. The glass shattered, amber liquid spreading across the polished surface. For a moment, no one moved. The guards burst in seconds later, flooding the room with light and noise. They seized Clara quickly, forcing her arms behind her back. She didn't resist. Her expression remained calm, almost unreadable. Lillian stumbled backward, breathing uneven, staring at the broken glass as if it might still reach her. "You're finished," she said weakly, though her voice lacked conviction. Clara smiled faintly. "No," she said, "you are." And then, a voice cut through the room. Cold, controlled, awake. Indeed, every head turned. On the bed, where stillness had ruled for days, the Duke sat upright,